I-40 was not too far away. Sometimes some of the truckers with their CB radios would have a real powerful one, and it would override the church's sound system. Let's see, what was it that they heard? Oh, it was two cities, and one of the towns was Hooker, and it was take two girls to Hooker or take two hookers to some other town was what some trucker was saying, and it came over the church's sound system. And anyway, they decided to put all the lines in lead pipes underneath so that there would be no interference by the truckers going up and down I-40 close to the church. Well, anyway, we were at last time dealing with Dr. Lehman's Christian ethics, and we're talking about what is God doing in the world and the political character of the divine activity. And anyway, as you know, I was reviewing the martyrdom account of Archbishop Oscar Romero in San Salvador and El Salvador, where the political issues of that country were quite terrible, and they had death squads and executing and assassinating Catholic priests working with the poor and so forth. And so that was a political issue of where God was trying to be present through the priests and through the way the church was involved. But anyway, but as you know, I've been getting ready to retire on May 31st. And one of the things that a couple of weeks ago I passed around a little thing to let you say what you'd like to do. In the meantime, I talked to Amy Venable, and she said she might be willing to take this class as a regular. She said she's tired of teaching seventh graders who don't want to listen and would be happy to, and didn't really want to go around to different adult classes all the time. So we'll have to see if that will work. But as far as I've got to clean out my office and move out my office, and I just really don't have a good place to work and prepare during May. So I'm going to retire from this class after next Sunday. So you can take a holiday and go visit other classes and then wait and see what develops when Amy gets here. But I had talked to Sarah, and they had some ideas and plans, but we'll see if Amy wants to jump in, and if so, how soon, and kind of restart the class with the style that you like, So anyway, but in cleaning out my office, I've come across some things, and I go through what I have in files, and is this recycle bin material, or is this something someone else might be able to use and hand it off to them, or something I want to hang on to for a while, because I've been so busy. I know what I'm retiring from. I'm really not sure what I'm going to retire to. And I know one can retire from a job. I don't know how one retires from one's sense of calling into the ministry. So I don't know what that might be. But I need time to rest and relax and reflect and take a little bit of Muzan's advice. Someone gave him, don't volunteer for anything for a year and wait to see what you really want to do. Because if you volunteer too early, then you're committed to something, and then the thing you'd love to do comes along, and then you can't do it because you've already committed to something. So anyway, I don't know. But I found some stuff on Christian ethics, which is interesting. Also, Stephen's not here today, but I found my notes on one of my systematic theology courses on process theology and how to understand that and explain it as different from other theologies. And Stephen's been kind of pushing me to teach on that sometime. But anyway, good thing I didn't bring it along to share because he can't be here today. Anyway, I did find some lecture notes on Christian ethics back in 1970 when I was in seminary and our country was involved in the Vietnam War. And Christian ethic class notes had some very interesting observations by the professor. And one comment I found in the notes states that there was no consensus in Christian ethics regarding national politics at that time. It was kind of like the ethical questions and issues were confined to the local and personal areas of concern, and they had never really gotten around to examining the ethical issues involved in statecraft and international relations. It seems that there were different moralities that would be used to defend and justify what political leaders wanted to do anyway. There was hardly a case where Christian ethics were used to try to limit or curtail the moves that the political leaders were making or were planning to make. As the professor explained why that was, and he began to back it up with some preliminary definitions and presumptions about reality, he came up with some of the philosophical ideas and foundational assumptions that were in play. And one of those was that without power, the existence of some power and authority resting within the state, the political institution of government, that political entity that keeps all of the population in awe. They used in awe, but what they're talking about is fear or respect. Without that, there will just be chaos, because without an overriding power and authority, each person or each family, each clan or each group will do what is big enough and strong enough to do in order to achieve its own interests and goals or its own safety and welfare. The second was, a part of the one overriding authority, there must be some sense of a common law, some mutually agreed upon and understood, written or unwritten, sense of what things are right and what things are wrong. That is some kind of common law understanding among the population. Now, without that, then there's no injustice, because without some sense of right and wrong, then if you break those ideas with behavior that goes against them, if you don't have it in place, then no one's guilty of doing anything wrong. Whatever you do, whatever you're big enough, strong enough to get away with, that's okay. There's nothing wrong with it. I thought of a simple thing like two people approaching each other on a narrow path. Do you crash into each other? Or do you have a knockdown, drag-out fight and the winner throws the other in the ditch? Or do you have an agreed-upon understanding, each goes to the right, and you just go by each other without a problem? Now, that's an example of an overriding kind of common law of what's right and what's wrong, what's appropriate, in order to have order within the culture and society. So if there is no power over all that there is, and that if you violate those rules, then something's going to call you into accountability. There is some kind of police force. There is some kind of sheriff or courts and so forth, or an army if you try to raise a militia to take over or something. But anyway, without that awe and fear and respect, then there would be chaos. I kind of think another example, the Western movies where some strong evil guy has come into town and has taken it over or taken over the territory. And if you oppose that person, then you're dead. That's just how it works. Well, the people get together and they hire a gunslinger to come in and clean up the town or to eliminate the bad guy, or they hire a sheriff. But the whole idea is to bring stability and security and to eliminate the chaos where might makes right. But within a state or nation, this sense of common law, the power and the authority, it becomes established, and there is order within the land, within the borders, within the land. However, this united, orderly functioning within a state or nation can be the very cause of disorder internationally, because a nation develops its national character, and it has its national interest and goals and objectives, which may come into conflict with some other nation or country. And so, if everything is orderly and together within that nation, it's real easy for that nation then to wage war against the opponent. Now, for Christian ethics, up until the 70s, the church had been captured by our own nationalism, or other countries' church organizations were captured by their own nationalism and had not developed a Christian ethics to reflect on issues of international disorder and conflict. Christian ethics had not really stretched itself beyond the individual and parochial issues in order to face the question of a global, a worldwide common law. Now, they were beginning with the League of Nations to kind of get started with that, but it hadn't been adopted, it hadn't been implemented, but they were in the process of making transition toward that. Another issue was the point that there was no longer one voice for the church, no church universal with some governing body that could speak for the church. Rome was the Roman Catholic Church, but the Catholics had split into Eastern Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. And then there were all of the Protestant denominations, and there was no one voice among all of the Protestants. Although there was a general, vague civil religion, and that was where we would have an opening prayer at the football game and pledge allegiance to the flag and so forth. And civic clubs would invite pastors to come do invocations and that sort of thing. However, the civil religion wasn't very deep, and it was more or less, God bless America, and pledge allegiance to the flag. And it was where the flag really became sort of like a religious symbol, sort of like the pagan gods in the city-states. They each had their own symbol in the god that represented the city. And so our flag was that kind of symbol that was kind of a god that represented our nation. And civil religion, it was, really wasn't a trinity, it was a quadro something. Father, Son, Holy Ghost flag. That were the things that were our symbols of loyalty and so forth. But there wasn't a real strong Christian ethic coming out of that for international politics. However, the Vietnam War raised a lot of issues because our moral credibility as the United States was being lost in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The fundamental principle was, our principles were being violated, which was that, as the professor was saying, all moral men hold that war is evil. A moral man or person cannot support war without a clear explanation of goals that have a reasonable justification. Now, World War I had some issues, but there was aggression, and World War II obviously was having aggression, and so it was easy to come up with explanations and goals. But in Vietnam, the goals, the purposes, the explanations for the war were confusing and contradictory, and some of the goals were suspected but never explained, like one of the big ones was a possible oil resources off the shores in Southeast Asia, and that's what a lot of folks thought that's what it's all about. It's not about communism, it's not about aggression, it's not about anything else, it's about oil. And that's our national interest. But anyway, all of that stuff was flowing around, and we didn't have a clear understanding. And large number of policymakers were basically Christian to a greater or lesser degree of commitment, and they were persons with personal values making decisions about American foreign policy, and they were realizing that ethics were relevant at that time, but only at the level of public opinion in order to win approval for the decisions that had already been made, was the way the dynamic was going on at that time. So when dealing with philosophical and moral questions, we must begin with basic assumptions about reality and truth in basic, broad, universal terms, and then move toward the specifics and the details, and then show how general rules and truths and principles apply to a specific situation or case or issue. So in the international politics and the actions of Christian ethics began with the question of the nature of man, or a doctrine of man in religious terms, or what is our human nature as human beings? What are we basically like? In his book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, in the book The Responsible Self, H. Richard Niebuhr led the thinking in terms of the idea of responsibility. He was dealing with that same question that we've been dealing with Dr. Lehman. What should I, as a Christian and a member of the church, what am I to do? But Niebuhr focused more on the situation, the context in which the person finds oneself in the real world, and asked, how ought I respond to this real situation? It's still, what ought I to do, but in the context of how should I respond to the realities. And it's it's realizing from that perspective that there are different conditions which may call forth different responses. Differing needs may call for differing solutions. And the context may acknowledge many questions about my own abilities and resources with which I am able to respond, or I am not able to respond. Before Niebuhr led the thinking in terms of responsible self, the individual person was conceived as man the maker, The human being, differing from the animal realm, is one with tools, who makes things. The human being builds, shapes our world, produces products, many of which last. They're meant to last. Aristotle reasoned way back when they were, even thinking in these terms 2,000 years ago, that every act or action, even thoughts, are usually made in pursuit of some goal. I mean, if you're going to go do something, you generally have some purpose, something in mind that you're trying to accomplish, to produce, to make. And so that raises ethical questions. Is that goal good? Is it worthy? Is it a worthy goal to pursue? And so when we're building a life, building a family, building a community, building a state or a nation, is that vision of what we're trying to produce a worthy one, a good one? Or are there flaws in it? Is there something wrong with it? Anyway, with the development of the nation state and the need for this overarching authority and order, the individual became viewed as citizen, one of many who were in need of this common law to establish order, but it had become so large and so uncontrollable in some ways that one's individual goals, dreams, sense of self-determination had to be subordinated to the national interest. Not necessarily the common good, but more in the sense of national progress to world leadership or domination. Now, this man the builder was also a drive to subdue, to control the world. First of all, my own environment, my natural world. I want to build and manipulate. I'm going to build dams. I'm going to change the course of rivers. All kinds of things to try to bring things under control and to dominate things. Now, I think this is a good place to show how this sense of what is the nature of man kind of idea and how it affects and built on it, that it leads all the way up into international policy and politics. I'll read a lot of this because it's more concise than clear than my trying to paraphrase it. But anyway, there was, and this is from a paper by Professor Ronald Stone, The American Realist Perspective on Morality and Foreign Policy. And so he is reviewing several thinkers and ethicists and theologians, but he describes a Heinrich von Treitschke's lectures on politics at the University of Berlin at the end of the last century, but century before last. It was in the late 1890s into the early 1900s. And it's called Machtpolitik, and which translates into power politics. And it was really foreign and alien idea to the American realists, but Treitschke, for him, man, or the human being, who is fulfilled only as a member of the state. A person realizes himself or herself in and through interstate war. War is not barbarism, but it is a holy ordeal willed by God, the outcome of which reflects divine purposes. Man is, first of all, a member of a particular nationality, only secondarily as a member of the human race. The plurality of states is an expression of human richness. No one state could fulfill the content of culture. Sovereignty, for Treitschke, is confirmed in the right to recourse to arms. Inasmuch as the essence of the state is power, the most powerful state approximates the ideal state. So if you can dominate the whole world, that becomes the ideal. War is the only thing which forces men to forget their private provincial pursuits and identity completely with the state. War is politics. The people become a nation only through war. Judgment by arms is the evaluation the world puts on the worth of a culture and a people. Meaning, if you go out and win the wars, you gain honor and glory, and you are valued in the world community, according to Trotsky's philosophy here. Now, anyway, that's what he was proposing, and that thought process became a part of the things that the German folks kind of grabbed a hold of. It was, does this sound like Adolf Hitler would say, yeah, I like that, yeah. And so anyway, and so we had World War I, where Germany became aggressors, and then we got World War II, and Germany became aggressors. And if that's the thought of the leader, but the populace went along with it because they had this same idea, and it was this strong sense of unity that when you get into conflicts and it does unify people against a great threat. And in our wars, when we entered into wars, we became more unified. We put away differences in order to be united to oppose the dangers and the threats. So there is that element of truth in what he's saying, but it's not necessarily an ultimate truth or a great value that you have to go to war and have conflicts in order to have unity. There are other ways of achieving that goal, but anyway, that's what happens. But within the mentality of when a people will begin to question the value of that war or the goals and purposes, then to question that then is deemed as unpatriotic. And you remember the phrases, let's see, my country, love it or leave it. That was about questioning our wars and whether they were just wars, or questioning policies. So anyway, this kind of thinking did spill over, and it got involved in our country too, as tapping into some kinds of thinking. And one of the things that has been commented on, that when presidents are having trouble, the best way to distract the people and bring unity is getting a war. We've got a common enemy. I remember we had some, I can't remember, I guess it was Millhouse, our bishop, that was not very popular. And one of the things that he did do in his not being a popular bishop, he did a wonderful job of unifying the clergy, because we would have, differences of opinions and, different positions on things, but with Bishop Milhouse, he made everybody mad, and he united us against him, and so there is a unifying force when we are engaged in conflicts. But anyway, in the Vietnam era, the strong notion of opposing forces of capitalism and democracy against socialism and communism was part of that justification and all. But one of the questions I had during that time was most of Vietnam was agricultural. It was rice paddies. And it wasn't a great industrial country. And it seemed to me that socialism would have been a much more, in its ideal form, not in an oppressive form, but in its ideal form, would be a more appropriate economy than capitalism, because they weren't needing and they weren't building factories and developing things. But again, a lot of times people confuse capitalism and democracy. The two are not the same. Capitalism is an economic system. Democracy is a way of running a country, a government with an election process. You can have a democracy choose a socialistic form of economy. But anyway, all of these got all wrapped up together and still tend to be confused. But in the development of a Christian ethic regarding international relations, the thinking developed to think of human beings as no longer the maker and designer of our own destiny individually. There are too many forces and factors that get in the way, and we have to learn to negotiate and compromise with other selves and other entities that may have competing and conflicting goals. We're not out there on the frontier with a big plot of land and no neighbors and we can just do what we want. We're in the midst of lots of other people and we're stepping on each other. So our ethic is concerned with what rules can we agree upon to use in our struggles and conflicts in order to resolve the conflicts and negotiate the solutions, i.e., the responsible self is the idea of the nature of a good human being. This process was transferred to international relations, realizing that our national interest and goals are not supreme and are not ordained by God, but they are in conflict or competition with other people and nations. And for Christians, national interests and goals may be in conflict with our view of God's will for not just our own people, but for the whole world. And as Jesus said, for the least of these, my brothers and sisters, in terms of feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, and so forth. The irony of the old way was that each side in a conflict would see the other side as enemy, and each side would pray to the same God for victory over the other side, to defeat the enemy. And it's okay to kill the other side because they are the enemy. They are not brother and sister under the fatherhood of God. So the more parochial Christian ethics and personal ethics that didn't stretch to the international level to reason about rightness and wrongness and so forth until, like I said, the Vietnam crisis made us really rethink so many of those issues. So this sense of the responsible self, the question of responsibility moved from dealing with ethical questions of man the maker who designs and makes something to achieve a goal, hopefully a good goal, to the man the citizen who agrees to live under rules of the common law in order to establish order and to do what is right and correct, where duty is one of the high values. But man the responder who does what is fitting, most helpful and appropriate to the setting, to the context, to the sense of what would be most helpful and to be engaged with the world and the situation. Before, man the maker and man the citizen were kind of detached from that intense engagement with the context and the situation. Before Vietnam, man the citizen operated out of the sense of duty. Authority sets the agenda. We respond dutifully, yes, sir. But Christian ethics and the international politics were not in dialogue at that time. But the intelligence and the reasoning, the goals and the costs to attain these nebulous goals made responsible moral selves ask, what is the real situation going on here, and what is the fitting response? Hans J. Morgenthau, a writer of the issues of political ethics, wrote that he concludes that unfortunately evil is inevitable in politics. So ethics in politics is the endeavor to choose the least evil action among the several options. The point is, in reality, that's what is going on. It doesn't begin with what is the best, what is the ideal goal we're trying to achieve and work toward that. We are involved in a mess. We have to make a decision. It looks like all the options we have are bad ones. To be ethical, we just choose the least bad one. Now, in the last presidential election, a lot of the electorate felt like that was our choice. We didn't have a desirable candidate. We just had two objectionable ones, and we voted for the least objectionable, or the least evil, as some would be thinking. So we can understand the dilemma of politicians wrestling with serious problems, and particularly on the international plane. And so often when we don't talk to one another, we don't engage with one another, we don't understand one another, it's so easy to be fearful of one another because we don't really understand one another, we don't trust one another, and so forth. But anyway, I found those concepts very interesting in terms of how do we deal with and how do we engage and be responsible. And in so many ways I know I do, you may not, but feel so helpless and powerless with so many issues and wonder when you hear reports and people talking about things, you just think, what are they thinking? Where are they getting the ideas that come out of their mouths? And I found this helpful, that some of the basic assumptions about who we are as people and what are our purposes and goals. But anyway, in this paper by Stone, I found some interesting observations in what they wrote. One of the things Morgenthau wrote about is called the democratization of the conduct of international politics, has also dealt a blow to international morality in Morgenthau's view. And he makes reference to the rule of conduct presupposes an individual conscience which responds to the rules. I mean, there's rules, and then there's a situation. How do you apply the rule to that situation? And he says it presupposes that it's an individual who reasons that. And he says when the conduct of foreign policy is definitely traceable to a monarch or his representative, the chancellor or somebody, these individuals could hold themselves morally accountable for the actions of their governments. Today, however, the vast bureaucracy of foreign officers hold no common consensus as to moral requirements. And, we have people who may be trying to be moral in their job, and then if someone above them doesn't like their moral judgment on an issue, they fire them. Anyway, there is no common consensus as to moral requirements, and no individual conscience is responsible for so many government actions. We complain about the bureaucracy, and when we complain about the bureaucracy and what happens through the bureaucracy, often it's this issue. There's not a one person in charge who makes the moral reasoning judgment about what is the right thing to do. Just following policy, just following orders, Anyway, it is one thing to say that George III of England or Louis XIV were subject to moral restraints in their dealings, and quite another to say that Great Britain or France today have moral obligations to one another. Even the vast turnover in the upper echelons in the United States Department reveals how nebulous any consensus of an international moral order is today. Now, today means 1970, when I got a hold of this paper. It seems the same thing happens in big corporations. We had the whole the savings and loan crisis. We had, all of this, the housing mortgage crisis. We had the Wells Fargo, people creating all these fake accounts and so forth. And where is the individual who takes responsibility and says, this is wrong, you can't do that? No, it's kind of, everybody's doing it. It's, it's the policy. It's, what we're supposed to do, or it's okay. There's not a real, anyway, but that's that idea he's saying, the democratization of the conduct, where there's so many people involved, but there is no coming together and reasoning what is the right thing to do. Anyway, Morgenthau feels that the influence of morality upon international politics has decreased with the destruction of the old aristocratic set which ran political affairs in Europe in the 17th and 18th century. These aristocrats shared family ties, a common style of life, the French language, and common moral values with regard to how the political game was to be played. And then, he says, and gives an example. The attempt of the Tsar to hire Bismarck to work in his foreign service is an example of the cordiality in the international politics of the past ages. But anyway, it's this whole change in how to reason and how to decide and work on things. There's another quote here. The moral confusion in international politics, as a subtitle. Modern nationalism has suppressed supranational ethics in the 20th century, and the ability of the nation to exert compulsion upon individuals has increased. The nation has available vast means of persuasion due to technological developments. The prestige of the nation has increased in a time when loyalty to the nation may require the destruction of several thousand lives by one individual in the name of national loyalty. That's when we launch a war or make the decision to, and I brought it up before, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then also our bombing of Dresden. That was civilian population in both of these cases where the decisions were made, and we can second guess or whatever, but those were really tough decisions, and yet they were made for us. We weren't consulted. So the weight of the national prestige and the decline of universal ethics combines to force most people to bow to the orders of the nation. And then he says, most people have sought to reconcile the tension between national interest and supranational ethics by equating national mores with values that should prevail over the world. The aura of invincibility that has surrounded American political action and the universal claims of Marxism have tended to polarize issues and to cause each of the superpowers to make unjustified claims for its particular system. Now, this was still in the Soviet Union days, but we're kind of migrating back into this polarization of these claims of who is the best and who should have the dominance in international politics. Claims of morality have been used to disguise the rivalry for power between the United States and the Soviet Union. And there is a tendency to see the Cold War in terms of approximating the religious wars of the Crusades. The equation of universal ethics with national goals inserts an element of fanaticism into the competition. So, anyway, here like I said, I found it interesting going through all of my old papers and deciding, to the recycle bin, or is there something valuable here that I need to review and hold on to, or can I hand this off to somebody who wants to get smart? But anyway, it seems like things recycle, and I was recycling some ideas that seem to be kind of addressing some of the things that we're experiencing right now today in the international realm. Things do not seem as safe and stable, and so there's some dynamics working. Anyway, I found some of these ideas kind of helpful to me to get my mind around some of the issues we're facing today. And then as a Christian, in layman's question, what am I as a Christian, a believer in Jesus Christ and a member of the church, to do? And then with Niebuhr's question, how am I to be a responsible self? How am I to respond? In what way? And it's difficult. It takes prayer. So let us pray. Dear God, we do need your help and your guidance, but clarity of mind and clarity of thinking so that we can sort out the dynamics that are in play and get the facts and the reality of what's truly going on, to make it easier for us to discern what should our response be. Most of all, we know it needs to follow Jesus and to be the loving, caring response, and to look to the least of these, your children, who do not have the power, and where we need to stand with or to reach out to and help them in the midst of the problems of our world. In Christ's name we pray. Amen.